the best projects are the ones where the incentive structures are very clearly defined and they align a lot of the different parties. I think the difficulty in anything with the built environment is you have a whole bunch of different incentives or values or pursuits. And so inherently, it's not going to be that easy to just arrive on a common goal. But
Yeah.
I think largely the developer, I think the design has some role in this too, and policy as well. Like if you can come together and say, this is what we're trying to do and this is how we're going to do it, and everyone agrees for the most part, then the project is much more likely to be successful, both financially in terms of design, in terms of the final product, than if people are trying to kind of pull in different directions. All right, everyone, we're back with another episode of Most Modern, an informal conversation amongst the three of us, Minku, Libo, myself, Alex, trying to break apart and maybe distill some of the topics that we address in our long form conversations with our guests. And this one is really on, I think, a question that many people might have, even outside of the traditional professionals that we deal with, the designers, the developers, the planners, but even just anybody who's interested in how cities come about, how things get built. One question that I had when I was growing up and when I was going through my architecture training, and maybe Minku and Liba, you felt the same way, is how do you become a developer? And can anybody become a developer? And we ask this question right now because I at least see, and maybe you guys agree, that we're finding ourselves in a climate where a lot of different types of actors, not just the traditional by the book sort of professional developers, are going into development. And so to answer my own question, I think you can. And I think our conversation here is to really sort of dig apart how that occurs and how, if you're interested, how you might actually get into development, but also understand the basics and the fundamentals behind development. So I understand development from a kind of, I'm conversational development, but I'm not a professional exactly. I leave that to my partner and co Wei Song. But Minku, it definitely is a fully legitimate developer. So Minku, what actually is development? I don't know if you can take us through a sort of history of the profession, what goes into it, what skills and abilities are required, and what do you actually do?
Well, I call myself a developer because I can't call myself an architect. Well, meaning that development is an area that is not protected by any licenses. If you think about it, development is really just building something. It doesn't even have to be a new construction. I think the reason why it's not getting licensed is because it's more of a communicator, if you think about the role. The developer, I want to quote Patricia Starrington, who is the professor at Columbia University. She has traced the history of a developer as a role back to 17th century London, when London as a city was exponentially growing, and they just needed more housing. So she described the origin of a developer being called as a new middleman, meaning that middleman actually gathered the resources together to make it happen, basically. So if you think about the resources for a developer, what do you need? You need a land, you need money to either buy the land and start the work. You need people, experts, professionals to help you design it and engineer it. And you also need to manage the processes with the city to get your appropriate approvals. And then after that, depending on your kind of way of making money with the existing building, again, the option varies after that. But effectively, this is what developers do. They build something to make money. That's what it is.
So you mentioned kind of the origins of developers happening in 17th century London. So before developers, like now we commonly know that developers are the people who kind of take on these large construction projects. But what happened before that? Who was in charge of building new buildings?
Well, before that, I think the land wasn't private, right? It was either owned by aristocrats, kings and queens. There was a centralized ownership. I think the birth of the developer started with the birth of the privatization of land, and also the need of this need of space due to this exponential growth of density in a certain area. So I think it was a very natural kind of origination of a need from the market, and some people who saw that opportunity just responded to that and brought things together. So we can think about what's needed in the current society, and then maybe if you act on it, you can make something out of it.
I always think back that the earliest architect was also the earliest developer. I always go back to the sort of the cave, finding a place to inhabit. Obviously, the utility, it wasn't financial utility, but it was actual survival. I think it's quite interesting in our context right now because we usually think of a developer as somebody who's trying to build for financial gain. Is that always the case, though?
I would say still the majority of commercial developers, I mean, by definition, if you're a commercial developer, you need to make a profit. So, but except for that, and that's why also the profit comes with scale. So at a certain scale, I mean, there is this reputation of a developer being this kind of larger than life character with this suit on and like 3-piece suit on and just like demand stuff in the meeting room. I think that era of development is certainly over, and there are many types of developers out there who doesn't fit in that category. But I think the general perception of developer being this kind of evil mastermind behind all the wrongdoing of the cities, I think, I just want to say that it is time for us to really explore like what type of developers are out there, because it is certainly not that only one who we kind of demonize.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe it's safe to say that there's a lot of values inherent in any given place, and that I imagine, at least talking amongst friends and colleagues, that there are people who have different sort of ambitions for what they want to do with their projects. So maybe let's start with you, Minku. You're working on development projects right now. What are those goals and principles that you're moving towards? And walk us through how you get there and maybe the challenges that occur. Because, by the way, I talk to tons of students who want to get into the development, but I don't think anyone has a clear picture of what it is until they're actually in it.
Right. So I wanted to do development because I wanted to be involved in the process of building from the start to finish. But I of course I didn't know how complicated that was.
Easier said than done.
Yeah, of course. So the work that I'm doing now, I think, are all non-traditional. Meaning, although I'm a developer, I don't own the land, and I also don't own the upside profit if there is any. But I operate on a fee, and the fee comes from me putting in my time trying to make the project work. And I find a good partnership model there, working directly with the property owners who's been generationally owning that property or have been living in that property for at least 10, 20 years. So they're difficult and emotionally attached to that place, and they don't want to leave. So there's one project that I'm working with, actually 5 owners who lost their building out of a fire in 2019. So it was an 8-unit property. The building burned down. They didn't want it to leave. They wanted to rebuild, and also see if they can make something out of it. And it was a very old building. They saw it as an opportunity to upgrade it to meet the current code, and also do something good for the environment by building a very hyper sustainable building. And also they wanted to have just a better space. So they invested a lot of their time and also initial upfront cash to hire me and my firm to help them, guide them through the processes. So we started with understanding their needs, hearing their thoughts on what they liked and didn't like about the previous building, what they wanted to happen. And we heard that there was this need of more space, and we saw an opportunity there. And we provided the design that everyone was happy. I also then started working with the city in terms of getting the necessary zoning approvals and also the building permit approvals, while the architects were detailing the design. And I worked with the owners to find the capital source to finance the construction. And we were luckily got connected with the local bank, and this project is in Cambridge. The local bank kindly offered, because it was a special project that was initiated by the owners. The bank was happy to offer like a 5% fixed rate, and this was 2020. And looking at what the rates are now, like it's easily up in the 8 to 9s. I think that was a huge win for the project, and it only happened because it had this kind of interesting group of people who wanted to who had more of a vision to continue their lifestyle rather than to make profit. So I think there is some value there.
Can you just describe the difference between a 5% interest rate and 8% interest rate? What effect does that have on the project? Because it's like 3%, right? Who cares? That seems really insignificant.
Yeah, but it's 3% on like a $7 million loan, for example. I mean, let's say it's, for easy terms, let's say it's $10 million. So 3% out of a $10 million is what? Like
300,000.
300,000. And if you think about the construction process, it will at least take a year and a half. So although it will be smaller, let's just simplify it and say, 3% of a 10 million is 300,000. If that doubles to 6, then it's going to be double to 600,000. So it is a lot.
Yeah, and then that just adds on top to the ledger, right? So everything else becomes more expensive. You have to hit higher returns when you sell or when you lease the property. Maybe you can't get nice fixtures, or you have to shave costs elsewhere.
Yeah.
And that's just something I guess developers, you can't really control, right? Or unless you have access to cheaper capital for one reason or another. So you would say that's probably the risky part of development, one of the risks.
Right, for sure. I mean, there are many risks. So I think there is this advantage, especially in the current capital market where the rates are very high, that actually encourages people to tackle development in a atypical, like untraditional way. Because there are advantages for a non-traditional developer if there is a strong mission. So for instance, Alex, you're working on this church to affordable housing conversion, addition project, and I believe there will be some benefits there, right? Maybe you can tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, I think it's actually, it's quite similar to your project in a lot of ways. So I'm working with a church in the Bay Area that actually their church burned down. So there's a similarity there, which is you get insurance money. That's cold hard cash that you can just deploy when you want to. You don't have to, say, take a loan on the reconstruction. Now, construction rates have gone up since they got the payout. So there is a difference there. But what's fascinating about that project is it aligns with what's happening at a state level where, for instance, the state is trying to incentivize more housing getting built. And so they look around and say, well, where can we build houses? You can't just take people's land away from them and build housing. So how do we make it so people who own land make it easier for them to build? And so there's a sort of, I think we can talk about this more later on, but policy allows for new opportunities to emerge where they wouldn't already. One of those opportunities is essentially on faith-based or faith-based institutions, or on the land of educational-based institutions, where you have something that is there for a long time. It's an active member of the community. It's not going in or out, but they have land that is underutilized. So primarily like parking lots and open spaces. Simultaneously, they have a mission. So the church I'm working with is not trying to make a ton of money from the project. I think they do want to make some return. And that's sort of passive income that can feed back into their operations. But it also feeds into their larger goal of housing people. So before they even tried to build the affordable housing, they were housing homeless in their sanctuary overnight, getting people out of the cold. And it's quite interesting to find these groups who, again, are not necessarily traditional developers, but they have these agendas that sort of align with the outcomes of development. And I think it's happening more and more. And this is why this question, can anyone be a developer, is quite important, because I do see people like churches or land residents, institutions, even corporations going into development to align some of their, the kind of utilize their assets in a way that aligns with their broader mission.
But I think an interesting thing emerges is that, like, while your clients, I guess, so to speak, they do require some sort of building to advance their mission, their agenda, but they don't necessarily have the know-how or the capability to advance that mission. So somehow, they found you guys who helped them realize not only the possibility of, building those things, but also how to get it through regulations, through design, through all these steps necessary to build a building. So I guess for you guys as developers, how do you find these like-minded clients to work with that have this goal, this need, but don't necessarily have the know-how?
I wish I knew it so that I can find more. But well, it is a struggle. I mean, I must say, it's just word mouth to mouth. Like it spreads, the word spreads. So I'm just in a belief that if you finish one project, if you have something to point at, you can either be the, vocal leader to spread the word, or people will recognize it. That will be one way. The other way, I think, is just good old traditional networking, trying to understand what people need and trying to meet more property owners, because they might have an idea. I'm sure they have ideas of what they want to do in those properties. But you're right, there is no kind of shared platform or place like known by everyone to where to meet, and discuss these things.
Yeah, I think it's one of the issues when it comes to just development in general. There's no marketplace for this. It's mostly who you know. Oh, this person has done this project. Let's pursue that there. I think when you're also dealing with the scale of development, that amount of capital that needs to be invested, the time that's invested, all those resources, you tend to go for track record. You tend to go for experience. So for a young person or a young professional starting off, it is quite difficult. I would say, for instance, I think I can say this pretty freely, the church project is a kind of this Goldilocks situation for us, where the project is probably too small for a more established developer to get in on. There's too much cost for them up front. But for someone smaller like us, we can come in and work with the client in a way that a more established or a larger firm just wouldn't have the appetite for. We also have the benefit, I think, of being able to do the finance, and Minku does this as well. We can do the finance along with the spatial planning and design. And that's also one major barrier of entry for people who want to go into development. You have to hire someone who can do the development services, but then you also have to hire the designer. You have to hire someone maybe who understands planning. So it's like getting this band together is really difficult. So for us, if we can do as much in-house as possible, it produces a more, I think, palatable sort of scope of services that we can offer.
Yeah, being nimble is what we can offer, right? Like being small, you need to be nimble and you need to be flexible. So for me, I think at this point of a very early career in development, I'm trying to more focus on what I'm doing rather than how much I'm making. So I'm trying to find like who I can help next, because I think that the overall goal that I have is basically to build a better building that can, help building a better community or more equitable place. So I'm more focused on that area. So I think one area that I'm trying to tackle next is the office to residential conversion side. And the reason why I'm trying to go there is, one, I do believe I have some close connections who are interested in that same mission. And also I see a lot of incentives and actual pushes and support from the city that has been a major issue. And probably if you're developing in the city center, I'm hoping and I'm assuming that the community process will be much lighter because there isn't many like condo units around. So I think it could be a good opportunity there.
I think you have to have a thesis. You have to address, like any business, you have to say, where is there a need and how can I fill it? And that's what developers do in the first place, right? They say, okay, we need housing here. We're going to build the housing for you. And then you have a market. You can sell it. You can be profitable and you can be sustainable in the business sense. So I think regardless of what scale you're doing development at, and by the way, there's people who just build housing like as a single person. They get everyone together and they say, we build a house here, we build an apartment there, whatever. That exists in a lot of places, maybe in slightly more cheaper cities than like Boston and San Francisco, but it happens all the time.
Maybe this is like a part of a broader trend, but I guess developers aren't traditionally known to be like a very creative profession, but it does seem like you guys see this market niche, kind of see a creative solution that you can apply there and really are able to make this project happen in a way that's not, I guess, what we would traditionally call like traditional development, right? You build an office, you build a residential multi-family unit, things like that. For your clients, like if there weren't developers like you who are able to find that Goldilocks solution for what they need, what are their alternatives in the traditional market?
Well, I think that there aren't many, to be honest. And that's why you have developers who, I think the developer as service model is increasingly helpful, because it used to be the developer would acquire the land through investment, and then they would hire the experts to do the professionals to do the design, the implementation, things of that nature. Now you have the service model, which allows for different scales of, I think, development to occur. So like Minku and I are working on basically the scale of a partial block, more or less. But you also have much larger developers with a proven track record working at the scale of like city blocks or multiple city blocks. I think a great example of that is the Chase Center in San Francisco. So the Warriors moved from Oakland to the city in 2019, right before the pandemic. And they basically acquired a piece of land and engaged a developer, Strata Group, to help them get it entitled, get it permitted. Strata had worked with the Warriors before on a different piece of land, and it didn't work out, so they already had that relationship. But I think it's kind of like matchmaking. It's dating. You have to align your kind of your mission, what you're doing at a certain time. I also think, Minku, let me know if this is your feeling, but it's really development, and especially working with partner, but also working with city. A lot of it is communication and making sure that you sort of jive and you can work well together, because there's a lot of difficult, thorny issues that come up, and you're going to contradict each other at certain points. So you want someone who you feel like is on your team. I don't know if that answers your question, Limo, but it's finding that match that is really, I think, difficult.
Yeah, it is difficult because, like Alex mentioned, there are plenty of development consultants out there who play in terms of residential, like plus 100, 150, or even 1,000 unit realms. What they consult is on a different kind of scale. And there are plenty of consultants that, consult in terms of like leases, retrofits, or fit outs of the new spaces, but they all are on, a much larger scale buildings. When we talk about, and the projects that we are operating, Alex and I, we're smaller than 100 units, but we're not at like 3 units or like 4 units. So we're somewhere in that middle scale, which is a niche at the moment,
Yeah.
and has been primarily dealt by mom and pops historically. But I see an opportunity there, and that's why we are getting some traction of projects. So I wanted to add to that. So going back to that Baugruppen model, the German model, in Berlin and also in other cities, the city is actually stepping into this realm by providing a matchmaking system. So they are allowing these type of architect and resident, the owner initiated projects called Baugruppen to happen in public land, and they also have a network of developers, development consultants, contractors, architects that they can also connect these groups to. So they have a professional network that will fit, that operates in that scale. So I think that's where potentially in the future the cities can be involved by, through their policies. But to answer your question, Libo, at this moment, I don't see that there is any sort of platform that will, if the property owner doesn't do his research himself, I don't think there will be any platform that will connect you directly to a development consultant that fits your need.
I think one thing, though, there's a barrier to entry too. I mentioned this sort of in my experience, but I think this exists more broadly. You have to, if you're trying to develop something, you have to have skin in the game. You probably have to possess the land already. You can't say, "Oh, I'm thinking about buying this piece of land. Can you help me develop it?" I think because it's such a long process and it takes a lot of upfront effort, people need to show that you're in it for the long haul, that you're actually invested. So holding the land is really helpful. In the case of my project, the ability, like there's a need, right? The church burned down. They're going to rebuild it. It's not a question necessarily. So that is also a way that helps people feel comfortable and say, okay, I'm committed. I'm serious about this. Because there's a lot of sort of noise out there too. And there's a lot of great ideas, but really development is not necessarily about the great ideas. It's about getting things done and making sure that it's feasible.
Yeah, and getting things done isn't easy, right?
No.
You need, it's a minimum of 3 to 5 year commitment. 3 years if you're very lucky, right?
Yeah.
So
I think broadly, one really great analogy that I think about when it comes to the built environment, when it comes to building a building, is the similarity between getting a building built and making a movie. So in Hollywood, you have scriptwriters who are constantly churning out scripts, pitching them, saying this might be a good idea. And then you have people who are reading them and saying, oh, is this going to be a good movie or not? Is this going to be something that people watch? A lot of times those people are the producers who then say, wow, I love this story. I'm going to make this film, but I need to raise the capital to get it done. And then you start thinking about how difficult it is to actually create a movie. Oh, okay, it's 2 hours long. How hard could it be? But you're talking about multi-million-dollar budgets and hoping for multi-million-dollar returns. Projects that last 3, 4, 5 years. The actors maybe only shoot for 6 months, but everybody is involved in the pre-production and the post-production, the marketing and stuff. It takes a huge chunk of your life. And so the developer is really like the producer in this regard. I would say the architect is more like the director, or some of the actors maybe. They kind of come in, give their creative kind of insight and get out, but they don't, and they get paid. They get paid once, but they don't have necessarily equity in the project. That you get paid. Obviously, contracts are different and set up differently and have incentives, but more or less you get paid for doing the work, but you don't get paid if it succeeds a lot or fails. Versus the producer has that risk involved.
Yeah, that's why you don't see, let's say, OMA designing triple deckers, right? That's how it works, because the budget doesn't, you don't have room in the budget depending on scale, and also if it's too small, it's probably better to do it yourself and think about doing it yourself. And the involvement of us, like, we need to be on a certain scale so that we can also be invested in that project together. So luckily, because we're a nimble small shop, we've been able to work with the property owners who wants to do something, like either rezone their land to add much density than what they have now. And that, we're talking about at least a $10 to $20 million. $20 million, I think, will be the kind of a size of projects that we're operating. So it's not small, but it's not too large, which makes it okay for us, I guess.
Yeah.
So maybe to take a step back and maybe contextualize kind of this shift that we're talking about. I think as you guys talked about, you mentioned maybe 3 broad categories: the traditional developer, the service model, and then developer consulting. Can you give us like a little bit of an understanding of like what's different across those 3 models, and why are we now seeing the latter 2 kind of start emerging and growing?
So the traditional developer model is what I mentioned before. Like, the developer comes in, buys the land. They need to have money, of course, up front. They need to buy the land, they design it, they permit it, they rezone it, they permit it, they either sell or rent it and make profit, right? So that's what the typical development model is. You are the sole owner of the project. You are the general partner of the equity stack, and you manage the overall project and assure that it gets completed, and also it delivers a target return that you have promised to other investors. That it involves a lot of risk upfront. The developer will need to put in a lot of his own capital and also his sweat equity to make the project happen on the front level where the risk is the highest. The profit, of course, because of that risk, if you manage to pay back all your capital partners, all your vendors, your engineers, architects, whatever is remaining is all yours. So depending on the market, that might be much larger. But what we are seeing now in the current market is the capital market is just frozen. There aren't many investment happening to new construction projects, even if it's in the residential market, because the rates are too high. The developers can't make their money work. They can't pencil. And also, I think the capital market, what I hear is that they're actually looking for excuses to increase the rate because they don't want to invest in real estate now. Like, look at the stock market; it's performing perfectly. So there is really no need for the capital market to move to that direction with this uncertainty. And because of that, there isn't many new projects happening, and a lot of developers are either just working on their permitting side of the projects that they have already in-house, that they already manage. So that opens up an issue, right? Like, the city will still need housing. There is still demand for a certain type of space. so in order to fill in that gap, the city is giving out incentives, and actually also there are opportunities for individual property owners to rethink about how they can contribute to this need of the overall city. So that's where this model of, but I don't have the money. I have the property. I don't have much cash to contribute up front. There are multiple ways to peel this together if that person works with us, because we provide the knowledge and the analysis tools to understand what can be built, how much that might cost, what's the potential return. We just provide this kind of business plan. So that is the second model. The third model can be like a really creative model where there's a certain piece of public land. You gather with your friends, and you kind of commit to buying the land together. And maybe you have an architect friend. You design it all together. That architect friend can help you design it and build it. And maybe that architect friend can also have some ownership stake in that mix. So you basically share the risk together all up front as maybe a co-op or a group, to dive in and do that project and make it work together. So I think that these are the reasons why we see a lot of uptick in this kind of alternative models, because the traditional way of building is just basically frozen at this point.
So is it fair to say, like, the traditional model, the developer holds a lot of risk, but also gets a lot of reward as an outcome?
Yeah.
But in these new models, right, the developer maybe is taking on less risk. They're working with more owners, more financial partners, but ultimately the reward is less.
Well, ultimately, yeah, the reward is less, but it can be more consistent, and and that consistency and the less profit can be used in more creativity on what that project is by sharing it with the other, sharing the risk. So not the developer solely taking the lot of risk up front, but sharing that risk with the others, and then also sharing that profit at the end.
The risk is more distributed in a model where you have a land owning partner as well as the development consultant or other capital investors, as opposed to a single entity doing it all themselves. There's no doubt about it. And I do think this is an interesting point, where I think if the risk is more distributed, I'm not going to say all the time, but it seems like the opportunity for more innovation could occur. The higher the risk, the higher the risk. You're always trying to maximize your risk reward ratio, right? So the higher financial risk you're going into, the less sort of risk you're going to take on the design side. I'm pretty sure you're going to go with what's worked before, what has been proven before. I'll give you, Hudson Yard, for example. Like, okay, there's some interesting looking buildings, but you could reskin them and it would be a standard development.
So that distribution of risk is very important, because if you distribute the risk up front, it means that you have multiple voices involved in the ownership, and that voices can represent different motivations, right? One voice, because the risk is tolerable for them, they can be valuing, having more affordable housing, or they want to, have this building using cross-laminated timber, and that's my interest. Like, I want to live in a cross-laminated timber building. And if that project seems to be, doable up front, then everyone just buys into that idea, and you just execute it, and it will be done. So,
but there, it is difficult, because more voices in the room means more opinions, and it's like the same as any corporate board. You go public, you start to get investors and shareholders. You'll have that financial support, but someone might want to do something else with their company. Versus if it's private, you can kind of meander and you can position it whichever way you want. I think it's the same with a real estate asset as well.
Yeah. But I think it's doable. I am experiencing that similar setting, right, with this project that I'm doing with 5 owners. If there is aligned goal, the goal is to build it in the right cost and in the right quality and on time. And I think we have a very good team. We have aligned missions, and also integrated some profit sharing options, and also, so basically the builders also get incentivized if they build, to code and to the standards quickly. So I think there are these tools. It's really a matter of communication, and because the owner groups will be the ones who will be ending up as neighbors, they are incentivized to keep a good kind of relationship with others, right? So the process isn't that wasn't that bad in my case. It was actually a quite kind of meaningful experience for me.
I think the incentive structure is a term that keeps on coming up in our conversations. The best projects are the ones where the incentive structures are very clearly defined and they align a lot of the different parties. I think the difficulty in anything with the built environment is you have a whole bunch of different incentives or values or pursuits. And so inherently, it's not going to be that easy to just arrive on a common goal. But
Yeah.
I think largely the developer, I think the design has some role in this too, and policy as well. Like if you can come together and say, this is what we're trying to do, and this is how we're going to do it, and everyone agrees for the most part, then the project is much more likely to be successful, both financially in terms of design, in terms of the final product, than if people are trying to kind of pull in different directions.
That's awesome. I think as we wrap on this really educational deep dive on development, I for sure learned a lot. But maybe you can, I guess, point out for us maybe some projects or some things that you feel are symbolic of this like new way of development that maybe you can share with our listeners that maybe inspire you to do something different.
Yeah, in terms of housing, there are many models, and what I know and understand is just a surface of it. There's one project called R50 in Germany, and it's part of the Baugruppen movement that it was initiated by the architect, and he just gathered his friends and with his professional relationship, he gathered this group of owners and chipped in investment up front, and then they managed to build the process. They got help from the city and they built it with shared ownership. So I think that is a good example that was widely published. And also there's Nightingale housing in Australia that is also quite popular in similar regards. Non-housing area, I think, also is quite fascinating. I think a local example in East Boston is called Eastie Farms. They are a non-profit community garden organization, basically, and they've built this geothermal greenhouse underneath, right next to a highway, underneath a signage, where I think it was a public land. And the architecture of that greenhouse is beautiful, and it is very actively used. It is mission driven. They do community food sharings, and they host a lot of events, and that is also initiated by a non-developer. So I think these type of projects the city will only benefit from, right? So we need to think about how to initiate more of these out of the box creative approaches.
Yeah, I think the headwind to that sort of creativity is actually distrust. So there has been a lot of sort of abuse of development in the past. I'm not going to deny that at all. I do think that there's a lot of people who are trying to, and institutions or organizations who are trying to grow the pie. I'm looking at, for instance, I mentioned the Chase Center, the development there. So that's largely accompanied with office space, especially around lab space. So UCSF is a major tenant in that area, the whole Mission Bay region of San Francisco. Just down the street, you have Mission Rock, which was about 5 years ago was a parking lot for the San Francisco Giants that they've held that parking lot since they built the AT&T Park in 2000, and it was time to kind of deploy housing on that site. It's really nice development with developed by Tishman Speyer, but including architects like Jeannie Gang, Henning Larsen, and others. And VRDV is one. Yeah, Escape did the landscape on the projects. So you have large organizations. By the way, the Warriors are valued at $10 billion. The Giants are valued in the billions as well. So these are not mom and pop organizations, but they're also not traditional developers. I also think that a lot of development's happening in the public sector, which is really interesting. Usually public sector is not looking for financial return in the terms of like, I'm going to make this amount of dollars and cents tomorrow or in 10 years. But what they are really trying to do is create economic development. So anytime a city builds an airport or renovates their airport, that's a form of development which is trying to incentivize economic activity, making it easier to get to the place, making it more attractive. Anytime a city builds more housing, they're trying to make it more easy for someone to live in that place and for you can see the negative outcomes when there isn't enough housing, but you can also see in places like Singapore and a lot of the Scandinavian countries the real positive benefits when everyone has a stable place to live. And so, for instance, Singapore Housing Development Board it's been basically part of Singapore's mission as a city, but also a country since it was founded in the 60s. I think these sort of large scale projects are also really interesting because then you start to see organizations who have a long-term perspective to try to get the returns. It's not just about building something and then 5 years cashing out. It's really about building equity and sustaining something over the long term. But you also have in, for instance, California, you have SB9, which is allowing for yards and lots to be divided, so you can actually build more on a single plot. The ADU ordinances that a lot of cities are implementing across the country are really interesting too, because then you have somebody who owns land saying, "I just want to build a 600 square foot building in the back of my house." That's development too. So the scale of development, I think, is getting extremely diverse, and that's really interesting because that yields a lot of different opportunities.
Yeah, the city initiatives are also an interesting part that we haven't got a chance to dive deeper here. But just to mention a few projects happening in Boston, like there's this example of a South End library that is currently being redeveloped to host, I think, a 10-story or more affordable housings on top of it. So it is being demolished and rebuilt to a high rise, and still having the library function on the bottom level of the building. Another example is even looking at this office to residential incentives that are out there, they encourage or they require actually an increased amount of affordable units in these developments. So the requirement is actually 20%, which is currently, for a for-profit development, they require you 13. So these type of negotiations and terms are there. And it is a great tool for the city to incentivize kind of out of the box thinking, and trying to, ask for creative approaches from developers to tackle these kind of social issues that the city is experiencing now.
It's really fascinating, and I think one thing that I notice when I talk to developers is that most of them, despite the characterization that Minku gave at the beginning of the episode, most of them are just people trying to make a difference. Of course, make a living for themselves, but I do see a lot of developers who are quite visionary, but also sober about the realities of implementation. I think that's something that differentiates architects and designers from the developer mindset. Architects is always like, what can we build? How can we make it better? Developers are really about how can we get this done, and trying to maximize that, but also being really kind of realistic about in terms of how that would happen.
You know what the major differentiator is? It's the guarantee. So like, because you're taking a loan to do stuff, like you need to guarantee stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to give up either your house, you need to risk, you need to have skin in the game out there. So that is the major differentiator. Like if you have invested that much and you can lose everything, of course, you need to make sure that everything happens the way that it needs to happen.
Yeah, you got to put your money where your mouth is. And I think that's not always a bad thing, to be honest.
Yeah, actually, that makes you also face architecture differently, right? Like if you are an architect and if you believe in your design really deeply, why not go build it?
Yeah, why not? Why not?
Yeah,
if you can get the money,
Yeah.
And I also, one other thing that differentiates development from architecture, I touched on this before, but developers have a long-term perspective on things, which includes the maintenance and operation of the building a lot of times, unless they're selling right away. But if you're holding that building, you got to make sure that thing can last and it doesn't look really bad 5 years later. It should hopefully look just as good as as when it was completed. And I think that involves sort of the types of finishes you use, but also, how easy it is to maintain something. Like there's a different perspective on utility that developers have, which I also think is really important when you think about questions of sustainability. Like, am I going to have to replace everything down the line? Hopefully not, actually. And that's where development and sustainability goals can actually align, or profitability and sustainability can align.
Yeah, I know some architects also put in their skin in the game too, by putting their fee as an equity piece, right? Like
a sweat equity?
In the future. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I would ever advise that, to be honest. Or at least make sure that
that is a way.
Well, make sure that if you're doing that, you're also factoring in time, cost, and money, and not saying, okay, if you paid me $50,000 to do the job, I'll take $50,000 of equity. That's not the same thing, by the way. So I think it's important to understand. But I've had people ask me to do that, and I said absolutely not. I mean, guys, it's been a really fascinating conversation, and it is. I personally think that anyone can be a developer if you put your mind to it. But hopefully this has been insightful for everyone in terms of how you can do development, what development really is, what it entails, the risks involved, the challenges, and I hope it opens up a deeper conversation amongst people, the audience, about what are the opportunities out there to deploy development in a way that aligns with one's goals. So this has been a wonderful conversation. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Most Modern Podcast on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. We'll be back soon with another season of specific topics and themes. But if you also have any questions or would like us to talk about anything in particular in this sort of free form format, just drop us a line or a comment, and we'd love to get to it.
Just do it.
Just do it.